and welcome to Always Take Notes.
A message from our sponsor, Arvon. Do you have a story in you? Or want to test the waters of writing poetry or non-fiction? Maybe you already write, and write well, but would like to try a new form or genre, pick up some new tricks.
Enter Arvon. Arvon runs a yearly programme of in-person and online events, from 5-day residential writing weeks that take place at one of its 3 writing houses, to a flexible online programme featuring 5-week online evening courses, masterclasses, and pay-what-you-can events. Arvon's courses cover everything from fiction, non-fiction, and poetry to screenwriting and even songwriting.
They've been running creative writing courses up and down the UK since 1968. In that time, their prize-winning tutors, many of whom may be some of your favourite writers, have unlocked the creativity of over 100,000 people. Many have gone on to be published authors and career writers themselves.
But actually, it's not about that. Writing with Arvon is about finding a supportive community of fellow writers, making like-minded connections that last a lifetime. By signing up for a course, you don't just get an acclaimed author as your tutor, you also gain a writing group to bounce ideas off long after the course is finished.
So whether it's a cosy stay at one of their writing houses in Devon, West Yorkshire or sleepy Shropshire, or a course you can do from the comfort of your sofa, Arvon works around your creative life.
Visit arvon.org/courses, that's arvon.org/courses, to learn more and give yourself the gift of writing. Hello and welcome to Always Take Notes. In this episode, we speak to literary agent and executive director of the Baillie Gifford Prize, Toby Mundy.
We spoke to Toby about his entry into the industry, about setting up Atlantic Books, his subsequent work as a literary agent, and about his work with the Baillie Gifford Prize.
We recorded this episode before the recent controversy over Baillie Gifford's sponsorship of literary festivals, but it's a great episode and we hope you enjoy it. Welcome, Toby, to Always Take Notes. It's fantastic to have you on the show. Could we start with Evitas, the literary agency that you run? What is it that you are looking for and how did that opportunity come into being?
Gosh, that's 2 questions. Thank you for having me, for starters. How did it come into being? So I was a book publisher for quite a long time, and for reasons that we may go into, decided ultimately that being an agent was the obvious next step. So I did so in 2014 and had my own little boutique agency with my name over the door. And I enjoyed it. It was very good fun. And I was invited to be a sort of tenant of Ed Victor Limited. And Ed was one of the last great super agents, if you like. And in his 70s had built an extraordinary business, but wasn't doing that many new deals, but had 41 years worth of royalty statements coming in every 6 months and needed to keep his back office running. So he invited me essentially to be a tenant with him. And so what that meant was I wasn't on his payroll, I was running my own agency, but then I was giving some of the commission I was making as an agent, running a company called Toby Mundy Associates, to Ed. And I had my apprenticeship as a book agent with Ed Victor, which was as good as it could have got, really, in so many ways. And he was extraordinarily interesting. And then poor Ed died when he was 79, and I had probably built up enough of a business at Toby Mundy Associates to go on my own, with my own little infrastructure. And at that time, I was in the US and I was having breakfast with the CEO of Evitas, David Kuhn, or the co-CEO of Evitas, David Kuhn. And he was in the midst of auctioning Amy Schumer's book for an enormous amount of money, if I remember. And we had breakfast and he was going off to run meetings and with publishers and Amy. And we were talking and he said, so what do you think the opportunity is in literary publishing, in literary agenting in London? And I said, truthfully, well, it's hard to say because most agencies are quite opaque. They're black boxes. But it feels to me, as someone who's been around for a while, that in lots of agencies, people don't want to be the boss and don't want to lead. And lots of agencies have quite peculiar cultures. And if I look back on my own career in publishing, there are lots of things, God knows, I'd never do again, and lots of things I'd definitely do again in a heartbeat. But the thing I'm most proud of is that for about a decade, that one of the business that I ran, the publishing company that I ran, had a really very good culture. We didn't all love each other, but we maximized our strengths and minimized our weaknesses. And our junior and middle ranking staff went on to become directors in other people's companies. And what was very interesting to me was that they all stayed in touch with each other for years afterwards. And I said, I think the opportunity in London agenting is to try and build an agency with a really good culture, a culture that is creative and collaborative and collegiate. because that may be that if you get that bit right, it may be that everything else sort of flows. And he sort of did a rather elegant double take and showed me an email on his phone in which he and his co-CEO, Todd, had an email exchange, which the subject line of which was building a creative and collaborative agency. And so that sort of amazing piece of serendipity meant that David and Todd invited me to, next time I came to New York, to spend a week in their offices at Avitas and to see how they did things, which I duly did. And then I took my normal meetings in New York, but I stayed in their offices when I wasn't in those meetings with publishers. And I was really impressed. It was a happy place. They were creative and collaborative. Junior staff chaired the key meetings. So I've never been in an organization. In almost every organization, it's the most senior people who chair the meetings. Not at Avitas. In the American office isn't. And I hope with us, it's other staff. It's the junior staff who chair the meetings. It means everybody else's voices are heard. It means there's a different kind of dynamic. And the people within the organization were encouraged to help each other, to collaborate, to share information and advice, and to all, rising tide lifts all the boats. And I was knocked out by it. So when they said, do you want to try and open up for us in London? I didn't have to think very hard. And then the commercial reason was that although I was doing exactly the same job when I had my own little agency called Toby Mundy Associates, there was just a ceiling on the kinds of clients I could reach because I was a one-man band, sort of nice and boutiquey and a little bit heroic. But ultimately, there was a whole bunch of interesting people who wouldn't entertain me as their agent. So I thought, well, if I'm connected to a bigger entity with a bigger provenance and a bigger footprint, and that represents already Hollywood A-listers and Pulitzer Prize winners and best-selling writers and journalists, then maybe I'll be able to have access to a bigger, more interesting client base. And that turned out to be the case. I also wondered if I was part of the Avitas group, whether I could move from being a local agent, that is to say, an agent who's primarily focused on Anglo-Irish writers, to being a global agent. And that's turned out utterly thrillingly for me to be the case. So I now, although I'm based, I live in England, our offices are in London, I'm an agent to 23 American authors, a couple of Canadian authors, Australians, Singaporeans, Indians, Nigerians, Bulgarians, and of course innumerable Brits, Irish. So that to me has been incredible. And the Avitas network and the Avitas company has been the key to being able to do that, even though it is essentially the same job that I used to do when I was a one-man band. I'm still doing the same thing. I'm still talking to writers, helping them, if I can, develop their ideas, and then representing their work to publishers in a way that maximizes those writers' options. So it's the same thing, but it's just within a larger entity, you have more reach. It's amazing. So it's been good.
We saw that in terms of this global reach point, that Avitas has its HQ in New York, but has agents in Boston, Washington, Los Angeles, Detroit, Nashville, Barcelona, yourself in London. How do the various kind of organs of the organization interact with each other? And what are the different things that they're doing?
Well, I don't know how interested you are in the kind of operational weeds of this, but we do a lot of stuff through Zoom, and we have very good Zoom conventions and protocols so that people can speak. We used Slack, which is tremendous as a entity. It's like a souped up notice board with different channels for different things. So the intercompany email is very small. I get very few emails from colleagues because everything is posted on Slack and so forth. And Slack is used as a problem-solving forum and a way of sharing information, a little bit of gossip, but also enabling everyone to keep tabs on, or not keep tabs, that sounds like surveillance, but to keep track of what we're doing. And it works. It works. I think probably... they were doing it in America before COVID, but I think COVID normalized it for all of us. And then if you put in place the right conventions about, not interrupting each other and raising your hand and various other things, it works. It's surprising. This morning we had our company, the UK team had their phone call, which is actually a Zoom call. And we had dial-in from all over the place. I was in Hastings. Maria was in Barcelona. People were in London. It was fine. It works. It's strange, but I think we've all worked it out after COVID, actually, somehow.
The first part of my question, was about what the agency is looking for. And you've mentioned this common culture, but what's the kind of common vision of the agency, if there is one?
I don't think there necessarily is one. We are not in the business of telling our agents what they can and can't represent. We would like to represent more fiction because we are a very non-fiction heavy house. And we have built up, my colleagues rather in America, I can't take any credit for it, but the American team have built up a very good children's and illustrators business. So they're representing to a great effect illustrators and children's book authors. But I think we would all like more fiction. Fiction publishing is a different business model to non-fiction publishing. And it'd be good to have access to that. So no, I mean, we just want we want quality books. And like most agents, we try to represent authors and not projects. Obviously, if Beyonce knocks on my door and said, would you like to represent my memoir? I'd probably say yes. But for the most part, you're trying to be a point of continuity in a writer's career and to be with them through thick and thin or, good times and bad.
And what's it like being on the other side of the fence, as it were? You had considerable experience as a publisher. Now you're negotiating with publishers. Is that very helpful, or do you have to be mindful that you're on the other side of the arrangement with this? What's the mesh between those two bits of experience like?
Deborah Rogers, the literary agent, you said it's two sides of the same coin. I think she's basically right. I mean, if literary agents didn't exist, you really would have to invent us, because a university in which literary agents don't exist, let's call it France, is a world in which every author is a supplicant to their publisher. And that seems to me wrong, because publishers' interests and authors' interests are not perfectly aligned. They hugely overlap, but they're not in pursuit of the same things. From my point of view, I'm helping writers to productize their ideas. It's a terrible way of putting it, but to turn their ideas and the things that they've immersed themselves in into things that publishers will invest in, whilst at the same time remaining true to that writer's ambitions and hopes and vision. And it really helps that I chaired hundreds of acquisitions meetings within a publishing company and have seen, I've still got publishing P&Ls. I could write one out now. It's absolutely indelibly printed on my brain when you look at these things every day for years and years and years and years and years. So I do know how those P&Ls fit together, and that does give me certain advantages. Some of the publishers with whom I work might say otherwise. I hope not. But I promised myself when I became an agent that I would not try to become a backseat driver or a publisher by proxy and all that stuff. The editors are putting money on the line. They're putting their neck on the block. They're the investor. It's their job to make decisions. And my job is to support the author and make sure that everyone is, everything is going well. So I really didn't want to be a backseat driver. And I think I think I've stuck to that pretty religiously. But it's helped. It's done nothing. It really has helped. And there aren't that many people on the agenting side who've run a publishing company. There are some agents who've been very senior publishers, but it's a huge advantage, I find, to have done that.
We'll come back to the agenting side of things later on, but could we roll back to the beginning of your life now? And when did your interest in books begin? Can you remember when it all took off?
Well, I grew up in the East End of London. I was a nerdy, bookish kid in a fairly rough school, so it was quite a difficult thing. So I spent a lot of time pretending to be somebody else, not unhappily, but it was odd. I had a couple of English teachers who I got along very well with and was good at English and liked it. I didn't love reading, but there were things that I remember reading Catch-22 and being amazed by it, and other things you read when you're a young teen. And then went off to university and did English, partly because it was the thing I was best at, and people do tend to like the things that they're good at, and I was good at it and I liked it. Did English, got lost in the weeds of critical theory, which kind of nearly ruined my brain and certainly destroyed my ability to write. And then was teaching English as a foreign language in the last part of the 80s. And while I'd been at university, I bought and sold secondhand records. There were still vinyl in those days. It's probably worth millions now, my old record collection. But there was vinyl, which I used to buy and sell. I liked jazz, and my friend Robert liked reggae, and so we bought and sold jazz and reggae records at book fairs, record fairs and stuff. And then I managed a jazz band, a collective of musicians, and a rock band, and would occasionally kind of drag my sorry ass out of bed and go to Camden Market and sell bagels and stuff to make some money. So I kind of liked business. And I was teaching English as a foreign language and doing a bit of part-time A-level tutoring. And I was at a dinner party at my cousin's house, and I was sat next to somebody, and he said, "You ought to try publishing." And I said, "Okay." He said, "No, but you like books and you like ideas. You talk pretty well. and you like hustling. You like, you get out and you like making money. And you think you might be good at it. And I said, but isn't it terribly badly paid and impossible to get into? And he said, well, actually, I work in a publishing house, and let me have a look on the notice board and see what jobs are up there, and maybe I can help you. And so that happened. There was a graduate training scheme at HarperCollins, and I applied. This nice man, Paul, coached me. I did all sorts of other things at his suggestion. And this is excellent advice for anyone, to this very day, with an interview in a publishing house, which is to say, on a Monday morning, I went off to my local bookstores and I talked to the manager about the company I was being interviewed by, to ask them what their experience of dealing with, in this case, HarperCollins was, and what books they'd had success with recently and what they had coming up. I went to the local county library and read back issues of the bookseller. And looked at everything, found out the name of who was interviewing me, and found out what books they'd been buying and reading and talking about. And this was before the interweb, but even so, if you have an interview in the publishing house, to this very day, going and talking to your local bookstore manager remains. I've interviewed more, I've lost count of how many people I've done job interviews with over the last 25, 30 years. And only 3 of them have ever said, yes, I went to the local bookstore, and it was like, the lights come on, Anything that doesn't involve pure internet research is a big plus. So that's what I did, and I got onto this graduate training scheme and was bounced around the company. The other people on the scheme, there was 3 of us. One of them was Venetia Butterfield, who now runs Hutchinson Heinemann, rather brilliant, my oldest friend in publishing as a consequence. And we got bounced around HarperCollins, and eventually I was working in the natural history department as a sort of editorial assistant, working on bird watching books and stuff like that. And I'd grown up in a sort of Jewish working class, pet-hating household in the East End of London. So to say that I had no affinity for these things was an understatement. But it was a gig, and I was happy to be doing it. But then Caris, who'd become my wife, and I went on holiday to Jerusalem. And we were staying in a sort of backpackers hotel. And we went one morning to a museum, and standing next to us in the museum was Stuart Prophet, who had just been elevated at the age of 31 to publisher or editor-in-chief of HarperCollins as the whole group, and had become slightly famous in the wider world for being Margaret Thatcher's editor. And I was dressed like a hippie and was making £12,000 a year. But light bulb came on, and I thought, well, and so I stuck my hand out and said, you don't know me, but I know you. And in fact, I work in the same building as you. And he was very charming. And then he said, where are you staying? And I said, I'm staying in that sort of flea pit hostel over there. And I got back to the hostel with Caris, and there was a nail hanging on the door and a piece of paper, and it said, Mr. Stewart, come at 8. So he did indeed come at 8. He took us for a very nice meal, for which we were grotesquely underdressed, and chatted, and it was fun and interesting. And I got back, and he offered me a job as his assistant. And that for me was extraordinary, because he was working on these remarkable non-fiction books. And it was a brilliant apprenticeship, really. And that was in the early 90s. And I was at HarperCollins from then until 97, when I was on the periphery of a rather large publishing screw-up involving Rupert Murdoch and Chris Patton, a book about Hong Kong.
Would you like to tell us about that?
Well, it's not my story to tell, except I had a vantage point on it, which was that HarperCollins had Chris Patton's book on Hong Kong called East and West under contract. It was a very, very good proposal. They paid quite a lot of money for it. And I think I was going to be working on some of the lower level editorial work. And I think my one contribution was to come up with a name for the book, East and West, which was not the most brilliant name ever for a book. And it coincided with the proprietor of HarperCollins, Rupert Murdoch, wanting to do a deal for Star Television in China, which resulted in the Chinese being rather unhappy, because it turned out they didn't like Chris Patton very much. And so the book stopped being published by HarperCollins and several people resigned, and it created an extraordinary media firestorm. It was the HarperCollins were very unlucky because it was a completely quiet news weekend. So as this story blew up, there was nothing else new. So it led BBC News for the whole weekend. And it also was on the front pages of in fact, all the Murdoch hating press ran it. And it resulted in Stuart, my boss's departure from HarperCollins. He subsequently ended up at Penguin, and of course has gone on to continue to do brilliant books. I also left, although I can't claim I stormed out in a huff because I was far too poor to do that. But in the middle of this uproar, the phone rang and somebody from Weidenfeld, an old colleague who I worked with at Collins, rang me up and said, "I bet you're miserable, aren't you?" I said, "I'm really miserable." And she said, "Well, there's an opportunity at Weidenfeld if you want to come." And before I put the phone down, which was, of course, a cable phone with one of those twangy things, I actually had my jacket and was walking out of the door. So I walked straight over to Weidenfeld, who were in Covent Garden, and got a job. So I can't claim I resigned in principle over this, but I did leave in the aftermath of it, and I was certainly made quite unhappy by it. But it was not my, as I say, the details of the story are not mine.
Fortuitous timing of the phone call, though.
Oh, my God. Yes, well, I'm not very superstitious at all, but I've had some very serendipitous breaks, yeah, and that was another one, yeah.
What was the role at Weidenfeld and Nicholson that you moved to?
So by the time I left Harper, I was, we're talking about a long time ago now, 30 years ago, I was running an imprint called Fontana Press, which is a posh paperback imprint. And they had, Paul Kennedy's book, The Rise and Fall of the Great Powers, and Hitler and Stalin by Alan Bullock, all sorts of extraordinary landmark nonfiction books. And I was, I think, senior editor there, and I went to Weidenfeld as editorial director in 1997, and then became publishing director there.
And then how did Atlantic Books come about in 2000? We saw that you were initially doing it from your spare bedroom. I mean, what was the route?
I had a nice run at Weidenfeld. I had a particular job from the, although I wasn't hired directly by Anthony Cheetham, the CEO, with whom I went on to work with in other capacities, I was given quite a specific brief, which is rather than wait to see what literary agents sent in, I was going to try. My job was to try and cook up ideas for books and find authors for those ideas. And then as a book publisher, you stand a better chance of being able to acquire global rights for that book, because there's a convention, as you probably know, with agents, that if the publisher has the idea for the book, they have the opportunity very often to bid for the rights. Not always, but often. So I was doing that, and we got on a very good roll, and some of the books were doing very well, and there was quite a lot of liveliness around them. And there was Morgan Entrikin was the publisher of Grove Atlantic in the US, and he'd had a tremendous, gigantic success with a novel called Cold Mountain by Charles Fraser, which had sold, I have no idea how many it sold, but 1 million hardcovers or something like that. It was enormous. I mean, for a medium-sized publishing company, in the case of Grove Atlantic, with a tremendous and distinguished backlist, it was incredible volume, transformative amount of income, revenue. And so he had a bit of a spring in his step, and he had a bit of extra profit, and his scout in London suggested that Morgan meet me, who I didn't know him, we hadn't met, and he was that very glamorous New York publishing figure. And he came to see me in my office in Covent Garden at Weidenfeld for half an hour, and then it turned into a longer meeting, and then it turned into dinner, and then I got home at 3 a.m. and we kept talking. And he offered me this opportunity to start Grove Atlantic UK. And we were going to be called Grove Press. But then we got threatened by being squashed by Bloomsbury, which owned the Grove Dictionary of Music, and said, you can't do that, because people will confuse this transgressive Beat Generation novel with our Dictionary of Music. And we said, but hang on, Grove Press have been publishing in this country, distributing here for a long time anyway. But in fact, Bloomsbury weren't going to back down. We were a start-up. They had a reasonably valid point. So we just called ourselves Atlantic Books instead, which turned out to be great because it comes at the top of all trade directories. So it was actually quite good. So that was I quit my job at Orion at Weidenfeld, part of Orion, in 1999, and registered Grove Atlantic UK Limited at Company's House, and then started up trading as Atlantic Books. Yeah, and I wasn't in my spare bedroom for very long. And the idea was that the Americans had these properties in which they had UK rights, and that the authors of those books would consent to them being published by Grove Atlantic, by us, Atlantic, in the UK. So that included P.J. O'Rourke, who was a major writer, and was still one of the biggest selling humorists of the modern age. Candice Bushnell, who'd written Sex and the City, and Mark Bowden, who'd done this book Black Hawk Down, which is extraordinary. And so the very first book we had, with Mark's tremendous support, was a book called Killing Pablo, about how American Special Forces tracked down and bumped off Pablo Escobar, who by that point was sort of a transcended James Bond villainy in terms of his evil. He was running mini submarines up the coastline into Florida and had a private army, and he was an extraordinary, horrible man. And so Mark had done a colossal amount of work on the book and had written a brilliant, brilliant book. And it was the first book we published. And so it was, you could focus on it obsessively. So Fiona McMorrow, the book publisher, had just started up her agency. So she did all of our PR for the first year, and we just focused everything on making this book a success. And it was a huge success. And it was a bestseller, big bestseller. Sold about 54,000 hardcovers and trade paperbacks, and sold probably now 300,000 paperbacks, maybe more. And Narcos, that TV show, gave it another boost and stuff. So we were able to arrive as a publishing house on the British marketplace with a really substantial bestseller, which was phenomenal. I remember going to Toys R Us and buying all the Tommy machine guns in Toys R Us, and then going to some geezer in Leicester Square and buying all the cheapest sunglasses I could find. So we got all the sales reps to line up with these cheap and nasty sunglasses, holding these kids' machine guns for a photo op with Polo. We did every silly idea I'd ever had about promoting a book. We did it with that book. And it was great. It was fun. Yeah. And then the other thing that Atlantic did was that Fourth Estate, which had been independent, had been sold to HarperCollins. Victoria Barnsley had gone to work for HarperCollins and had taken with her the company which had become part of HarperCollins. And Fourth Estate was the publisher of Guardian Books. So this was the year we started Atlantic. Fourth Estate was the publisher of Guardian Books. And so I couldn't say I knew Alan Rusbridger, who was the editor of The Guardian, but I knew him enough to send an email, which was to say, I noticed this has happened. Surely Rupert Murdoch's not going to be publishing Guardian Books. I've got this, I'm part of this I've got this new publishing company. Would like to have a chat. And Alan didn't reply, but the email got ricocheted down and somebody did reply. And to my utter amazement, they said, yes, let's have a chat. So although we'd published at that point, I think, no books and had virtually no infrastructure, we ended up becoming the publishers of Guardian Books. And that was a terrific business because you had the Guardian Media Guide, which was a big thing in those days. You had the Guardian crossword books, which sold in terrific quantities and were very cheap to produce. You had university guides and guides to the general election and collections of columns, Simon Hoggart's columns and various others. And it was wonderful. So although we didn't have a backlist, we did have this sort of ballast. And it remains a marvel, amazing to me that the Guardian, there was a beauty contest. There were a couple of other much more established publishers, all publishers at that point more established. There were a couple of other established publishers going for the Guardian gig, and they gave it to us, to my total amazement. And it was wonderful. And again, I think probably we got the gig partly because all the other people who were going for it had a day job. They had things to do. Whereas I just could focus obsessively on this. So I remember going, when we were making the pitch for The Guardian, to hang out with a designer friend, Chris, and we would just invent Guardian books that didn't exist, and Chris would design the cover for them and blow it up, and then I'd wrap it around a piece of polystyrene. So I went to the presentation with all these dummy books, bits of polystyrene of all these various sizes. So it made for quite good theatre. And then Morgan Entrican, my business partner and boss, he came to that meeting with The Guardian as well. And as I say, to my utter amazement, Alan and the folks there gave us that gig. So we got up, we had some terrific luck and got up and running quite quickly as a company. And that was all in 2000.
I was going to say, how quickly did things progress from there? Because you won Editor of the Year at the British Book Awards in 2005 and then Independent Publisher of the Year in 2008. How quickly did things snowball from 2000 onwards?
We had fantastic luck looking back on it. So, there was a structural thing that went on, which was that the net book agreement, which had, as you know, had controlled the prices at which books were retailed, was swept away in the second half of the 1990s. So publishers were free to, retailers, booksellers were free to discount books. And in the aftermath of the net book agreement being abolished, there was this sort of incredible renaissance of independent publishing. And I thought for quite a long time why the two things could whether that's a coincidence. I don't think it was. I think with the net book agreement going, it meant that supermarkets came into play in publishing. And so the big corporations saw this absolutely brilliant opportunity, quite rightly, to shift a lot of books at low prices through supermarkets who had previously never been that interested. And so that meant that they geared their businesses much more towards volume supermarket sales than they had ever done before that. And that made them, I'm generalizing, but I think it's basically true, that made those big corporations, or at least the publishing leaders within those corporations, a little bit more queasy about books that needed explaining. Now, that's not to say that the corporations stopped publishing good books, because plenty of good books were published by those places, but they published fewer of them, and the sales departments, who had previously not been that dominant within publishing houses, became very dominant, I think. And so they created this opportunity that Fourth Estate pioneered and then were bought by HarperCollins, of just independents doing quirky books that needed explaining. And that was our specialism. And I think to this day, the two poles around which publishing all revolves are the original and the proven. It's the same principle as PR. So if you don't have a story to tell about a book or the author, about either the book itself or the author of the book, that involves at least one of those two ideas, the original and the proven, you haven't got anything to say. You've got a really big uphill battle to publish or to represent it, as I do now. And what happened was that in the advent of the netbook agreement going and supermarkets coming into the business and driving volume growth and revenue growth, the big corporations got much more focused on the proven. And so the originality business became what independents did. So you had, Andrew Franklin starting Profile, an extraordinary business, Jamie Bing running Canongate. We were doing our bit. There was Text in Australia, amazing publishing that they were doing. There was Granta, there was Serpent's Tail, and we had access to incredibly interesting original work. And although the corporate publishers were slightly less interested in that work, the media and the book trade was very happy to support it. And we also had buyers at Waterstones who were incredibly enthusiastic as well. So the buying team at Waterstones in the early 2000s saw part of the thrill of their job as being able to make bestsellers, make successful books. And so they would regularly pick books by independents, including books that Atlantic publish, and transform them in terms of the way that they were sold and published. So it was exciting in those days, independent. We grew really, really quickly. All the independents grew really, really quickly.
We are thrilled to announce the publication of Always Take Notes, Advice from Some of the World's Greatest Writers. The book, edited by the two of us, features contributions from almost 100 past guests on the podcast. It's a distillation of the wit and wisdom we've heard over the past 6 years.
The book offers, we think, frank and entertaining guidance on writing in particular and living a creative life in general. It answers questions such as, where do the best ideas come from? How do you stay motivated? What does it take to become a published author? And how do you actually make money from your writing?
Published by Ithaca Press, Always Take Notes, Advice from Some of the World's Greatest Writers is available now in all good bookshops. We hope you enjoy reading it.
Could you tell us about the experience with The White Tiger in 2008 and that winning the Booker Prize, and how that came to pass and how that changed things for you and the company?
Oh, my God. Well, yeah. Writers published by Atlantic Books have been shortlisted for the Booker Prize 3 times prior to The White Tiger, I think. Maybe 4. We published Damon Galgut, who would later go on to win. We were publishing him from very early on. We published Richard Flanagan, who would then go on to win, but Damon had 2 novels that were shortlisted with us. Brilliant novel by Ahmad Dangor called Bitter Fruit was also shortlisted for the Booker Prize. So we've been having some wonderful recognition, or our writers have rather, more importantly, been getting some wonderful recognition for those books. Ravi Merchandani joined Atlantic Books, having had an extraordinary career up to that point, publishing gigantic successes, and really almost at the height of his powers as a fiction acquirer. And again, it's more his story to tell, but as I remember, he'd been at a party, a publishing party, and had heard about this Indian novel that was on submission, and rung up the agent and said, I hear this book is out, will you send it to me? That had happened. He started reading it and he texted me, I think, and said, this book is extraordinary, and sent it to me, and I was reading it as well. And then we carried on reading it. And we thought, this is remarkable. He was super gung-ho about it, and he completely saw it. And I really loved it too, but I also knew I was going to back him. And then the auction began, and then it wasn't that expensive, but we were a very small company. But I sort of decided that we should sort of more or less spend whatever it was going to take to get it. Because I think at that point, I was more confident in Ravi's judgment than he was in his own judgment. But I just thought there's something about this book. And we ended up getting the book for not an indecent amount of money, quite a lot. For an independent publishing company, quite a lot, but not by corporate standards, anything particularly. But it was a lot. But by the time an independent publisher like us had acquired a book like that, everyone in the company had read the book. I mean, we're all scared. We're spending a lot of dough for us. And so we had terrific buy-in from all the staff. All the senior team had read the novel. We were going to be gung-ho. We knew it was eligible to win prizes. We knew it could be read by men and women. We knew it could be sold in home and export. We knew it was reviewable. It was a debut, which was also always thrilling for publishers and retailers. And so we got the book. And there was something about the book from the outset. So Aravind was over in the UK after we acquired the book, and this was in the sell-in phrase of the book, so in the 6 months prior to its publication. And we gave a little dinner for Aravind in a restaurant. I remember it really well. And, half a dozen literary editors and journalists came to the dinner. So normally as an independent publisher, to get any literary editor to come to a dinner of an unpublished first novel is incredibly difficult. But Andrew Holgate, who was the literary editor of the Sunday Times, came, and a bunch of other people came. And we all had the same feeling that there was something about this book. And that never happened. Then the book sold in really well. The retailers responded to it brilliantly. It had a fantastic cover. I think John Gray did the cover. There was just a terrific feeling about it. And then it started to sell and got really good reviews. And then the Booker thing came along. And so obviously we submitted it for the Booker Prize. Yes, I remember it very clearly. The global financial crisis was just starting because the Booker Prize was awarded in the autumn. So by this point, Lehman Brothers had just blown up, and I had this deep anxiety in the pit of my stomach that we were a relatively young business. We didn't have a big backlist, that the whole economy might be about to totally blow up, and that it would be an extraordinarily useful thing if we could win this massive literary prize that would flood our business with money at exactly the moment that the global economy is completely tanking. I mean, I've summarized what I was thinking, but I had virtually that entire thought.
I believe it's what kids call manifesting these days.
Yes, probably. And as soon as the book was longlisted and Lehman Brothers had collapsed, I thought, oh my God. And then I think, I can't remember, I think we were the only independent publisher on that shortlist. I may be misremembering, I may have. But I do remember thinking, gosh, of all the publishers who have books on this short list of the Booker Prize for this year, we are probably the ones who could most usefully win the prize. And we clearly had a book that was in contention. In previous years with the Booker Prize, you can sort of feel if your book is in the top half of the draw, the top three or the bottom three. Somehow it's the media vibe and what have you. Then we got there, and Michael Portillo was the chair of the judges. And I didn't know him from Adam. I met him a couple of times, but I didn't know him. But Ravi and I walked in with a couple of our colleagues and with Aravind, and Michael Portillo was standing in the lobby waiting for a friend, I think. And I just walked up to him and said, can I introduce you to one of your shortlisted authors, Aravind Adiga? And the way that Michael Portillo greeted him and his body language was so open and obvious, I just thought, shit, we've won. It's won. And I turned to my colleagues and said, did you just see that? And it was something weird. It was like he greeted him like an old friend and lit up when he met him. And I thought, oh God, you've just decided he was the winner like an hour ago. So I then had this sort of very bizarre moment thinking, has Aravind won with his first novel? And then, there's that moment when the winner is announced and there's this rush of energy in the room. There's a sort of photograph of everyone standing on their feet, whooping around our table, except me, who looks like totally dumbfounded, with like sitting down with my eyes popping. And it was an extraordinary evening. It was a great party afterwards, and the book went on to sell 1 million copies, which was really extraordinary, and was a terrific high point. I mean, it was managing success in publishing is challenging, and I probably would have managed it differently knowing now what I know. But nonetheless, it was a fantastic experience. And Ravi has subsequently gone on to win published books that have won the Booker Prize again and multiple other big prizes. But I think for him, it was a major professional event as well.
Can we talk about a different prize, the Baillie Gifford, formerly the Samuel Johnson, your executive director? When did you become involved, and what does an executive director actually do?
So the prize had a steering committee. The NCR, National Cash Register Prize, which was a non-fiction book prize, I think folded in 98 or 99. And Stuart Proffitt, my friend and the publisher, and Dottie Irving, who was a big PR executive, thought that there was a need for another book prize. And I think with Peter Hennessy, the historian, they found a benefactor who remained anonymous and created this thing called the Samuel Johnson Prize. And there was a steering committee of the great and the good, and in some instances the not so good. And I was invited to join it as an independent publisher. And at that point, it was the BBC Samuel Johnson Prize, but the BBC, who were very well-intentioned, it was sort of torture being involved with them because their stipulations were so there was this constant pressure not to be doing anything commercial, not to be marketing it and so forth. It was very, very complicated. But they were terrific partners of great good faith. But it was just complicated. And then we were alerted to the fact that the BBC probably weren't going to financially support the prize much longer. At that point, I was a simple trustee, a sort of steering committee member. I knew somebody who I thought would support the prize, who liked the idea of it and would possibly sponsor it. And so there was a meeting of the steering committee at which it was clear that the BBC weren't going to proceed. And I was able to go and step out onto the street. It was a sort of cold September evening. Step out onto the street and ring this person. And this person agreed on the phone to me to support the prize for 3 years with quite a decent amount of money. So I had this bizarre moment of walking back into them saying, actually, I just, so that was great. And we had another anonymous benefactor at that point. And it was also clear at that point that the thing was growing in its complexity and needed a full-time administrator. And I was invited by the steering committee to become that person. And it's been a fantastic trip. And so the company is a not-for-profit, obviously. It's a company limited by guarantee. We now have a board of directors. We have terrific, benign sponsors. And my job really had 3 parts. One was to manage our sponsors. So when this anonymous benefactor supported us with 3 years of money, that came to an end and I had to go and find more sponsorship. I went to see my old boss, George Weidenfeld, who sat in his flat at probably aged about 90, wearing a giant pair of silk pajamas and who talked in vast paragraphs about everything. It was extraordinary. And he said, "Dear boy, this is never going to work. You're going to have to kiss a lot of frogs." And but actually, we made quite a lot of overtures. But eventually, Baillie Gifford emerged. There's one other as well, but Baillie Gifford emerged, and they were perfect, they were extraordinary. And so we're able to bring Baillie Gifford in as sponsors in, I can't remember, I think it was 2017. The condition, and so the survival of the prize was at stake. It involved changing the name of the prize from the Samuel Johnson Prize to the Baillie Gifford Prize, but that was a tiny price to pay to have such a benign sponsor. They've been fantastic partners, absolutely remarkable in so many ways. And so my job really is to partly manage the sponsors, but I don't need much management, but to be in contact with them. Partly to have the PR and communications company reporting to me because I have to report to somebody. I have P&L responsibility for the prize, so I'm responsible for the numbers. And I'm instrumental in appointing the judges, although obviously I don't judge the prize. The chair is the guarantor of the prize's independence, and every year a new group of judges come together. But it's a wonderful job. And, I believe we live in a society that grossly over-awards investment bankers and other people. So the idea of giving writers a cheque for £50,000 seems to me to be an entirely worthwhile enterprise.
We saw this fairly extraordinary statistic that said that for average of 6 winners of the prize, they receive a 857% boost in sales. How important are literary prizes as kind of marketing tools for the industry?
Yeah, they're very important. I mean, Yeah, we did the analysis because Porter Anderson, Publishing Perspectives, was challenged us to say, is all this worthwhile from the publisher's point of view? And the data emphatically shows that it is. To win, I mean, not every prize benefits in the same way. Not every winner of the prize benefits in the same way. But the winner of the prize will see dramatic uplift in sales in the first 4 weeks, but then ongoing. And then the paperback sales are generally transformed as well, massively so. And publishers absolutely think so. I mean, they are really happy to win these things. In terms of prizes, I mean, I sort of think the more the merrier. Why not recognize great work? They are slightly against the current of our times in the sense that they're elitist. They're choosing one thing over another. And saying one thing is better than another. But actually, I think it's a great consumer service. The public, there are plenty of ordinary readers who think, well, this is a great book. I'll read the winner of the Booker Prize and I'll read the winner of the Baillie Gifford Prize because I know they're going to be great and it is a hallmark of quality. Retailers tend to like it and like them and support them. It takes a long time to build these brands, I think. And money is not the most important things. I mean, there are some book prizes that have offered more money, but have never really captured the public's imagination. I think in the British context, you need to make one award. So the American system, where there are multiple Pulitzer Prize winners, multiple National Book Award winners, doesn't make sense to the British marketplace. I think the Brits like one winner, one award, not shared winners, and that those awards take quite a long time to build their credibility. So the Baillie Gifford Prize was 25 years old last year. First award was 1999, which was Stalingrad by Anthony Beevor, which was Jen Nochte was the chair of the judges in that first year. And it takes a long time. So the prizes that are starting up now might take them a while to build up credibility. And it is, they do fall away because the funding falls away. And, I'm optimistic that Baillie Gifford will remain enthusiastic partners, but we can't take them for granted, and we have to keep coming up with things that will continue to develop the prize. And our current strategy with the prize is to expand its profile in America.
To return to your career chronology,
Sorry, yeah.
No, not at all. You left Atlantic Books in 2014. Why did you make that decision? Why did the time feel right then? So
we had 10 ridiculously lucky years, really, where almost everything we tried out worked. I mean, there were some big howlers, mostly down to me, but publishing-wise, but most of the stuff that the team bought worked really, really well. And then we grew the company, and by growing it, invested in overheads, and the turnover went up, the revenue went up, but not proportionally high enough for the overheads that we'd put into the business. So it got very lumpy. We had a difficult 4-year period, and it involved some arrangements with our shareholders. And eventually, by 2014, I was in the process of helping to organise, it wasn't just me, but helping to organise Allen and Unwin, the Australian publishing company, take full control of the business. And I thought this was a brilliant result. I thought they were really decent people. They already knew the list. They already knew the company. They were already a minority shareholder. They were our Australian distributors. And I thought this was the best possible result for the staff and for the authors and for the company. But for me, it would have been my third proprietor in 15 years. In order to keep the company going, my own shareholding and equity had been very heavily diluted because we'd had to take in some debt to keep the company going. So I didn't have any skin in the game, or not any. I didn't have anything like as much. And I think they were going to keep me. At least they said they were, and that would probably have carried on for a while. But they also wanted different prerogatives as the owners of the company. And I thought it was a good time to jump out of the window. So the deal was done with Allen Unwin on the 1st of June. And I jumped out of the window on the 10th of June 2014, and I'd planned it really for the previous 6 months. And I'd planned it with Ed Victor for that period. So my plan was to take the summer off and then see if I could set up shop as an agent and announce, insofar as anyone could care less, in September 2014 at Frankfurt. And that's pretty much what happened. And it was a slightly discombobulating experience, but I'm really glad I did it.
Just returning to the agenting side, one thing we always are interested to ask agents is how many writers they represent and how is the time divided between the different writers on the list?
I represent a lot of writers. When I first started up as an agent, Johnny Geller, who's been on your podcast and is obviously a major industry figure, and I had a conversation. He said, well, the thing is about specialising in non-fiction is that you wake up one morning, you could easily have 100 clients. And I thought, no. And in fact, that's easily the case. But I don't know because I don't keep count. I keep track of whether I can service my clients and advise them properly, but I don't keep track of how many. But it's a lot. It's a lot. But this is another kind of difference between fiction and non-fiction in a sense, because I do almost all non-fiction these days. I'm almost completely out of the fiction space. Although I was quite a good literary fiction publisher and had some critical and commercial success, I just found it too hard to represent literary novelists. Whereas with non-fiction writers, I was able to help them in more meaningful ways. But, if I represented crime writers, those people could be doing a book a year. And so if I had 80 clients, which I may or may not have, I had no idea, but if I had 80 clients, they were all crime writers, I would just collapse under the weight of incoming. But non-fiction writers, even the most productive non-fiction writers, if they do 3 books in a decade, they're really knocking themselves out.
When you talk about keeping track of kind of looking after your clients, how are you kind of monitoring how you're looking after your stable of authors?
At any one time, I'm probably working closely with 15 writers, could be 20. And those 20 are at every stage, which is to say, some of them are seeing their books being published in paperback, as happened today for one of my clients. Some of them are seeing their books published in hardcover. Some of them are delivering their manuscripts. Some of them are having a tense conversation with their publisher about their book jacket. Some of them are working on their book proposals. Some of them had book proposals out on submission by me, which I'm hoping to place with the publisher. Some of them are in conversation with me about an idea that's sort of forming in their minds, and is it a book or is it something else? And so that's the range of conversations, from a conversation as I had today with 2 writers about an idea that's coming into focus in their minds, and my job at that instance is to be a sort of sounding board or a kind of catalytic converter whereby I'm encouraging them to think out loud and help them to try and crystallize the idea that's forming in their mind. And occasionally I do say things like, but that's brilliant, but if we turn that through 30 degrees, maybe this will even be better. And I view my job as being to be right, or more often usefully wrong, but either is fine. So that's at one end of the spectrum. I'm talking to people who are cooking stuff up and it's forming, bubbling away in their brain. And at the other end of the spectrum, we're talking to people whose paperbacks are just being published, and what's the paperback campaign, if any, to support it. And so that's about 20 writers at any one time. And that's about as much as I can handle, probably.
As a final question from me, you mentioned to us Chip War by Chris Miller and said that this changed your life as an agent. Could you tell us about that?
Yes. So I had this idea that might have been a fantasy about whether it was possible to operate from the UK, but to actually run an international client list. And I had some American clients, and one of my American clients was a rather distinguished Washington figure. And he introduced me to a brilliant young historian called Chris Miller, who was writing this book, which was essentially a political history of the computer chip. And I read the proposal and thought, oh my God, it was like being handed a missing piece of the jigsaw of reality that you didn't even know you didn't have. China spends more money importing computer chips than importing oil. It can't make them itself because of Moore's law, computer power doubling every 18 months. If China is 3 years behind America in computer chips, that's 2 orders of magnitude behind. It's miles behind. There's only one company in the world that can manufacture ASML, I think. Only one company in the world that can manufacture the machines that cut computer chips in Holland. The TSMC factory in Taiwan is the biggest and most expensive factory in the history of the world. It costs like $17 billion to build, and in 1 year produces more components than all of humanity has ever made by manufacturing or in its entire history. I mean, the trillions of products come out of that organization every year. So everything I read, it was sort of mind-boggling. And I got very excited and was able to offer Chris a little bit of editorial advice about the proposal, and we worked on it a bit, but he was brilliant and very, very good. And I compared it, which I'd resisted doing, to a big book called The Prize by Daniel Yergin about the oil industry, which is a classic book. I started off with an American author to American publishers directly saying, I've hesitated for years to compare any book to Daniel Yergin's book, The Prize, but I think this is the one to do it on. He's brilliant. Come and have some conversations with him on Zoom. And the auction was extraordinarily exciting and was very competitive. And the book went on to win the FT Business Book of the Year and has changed the conversation, was chosen by Obama as one of his books of the year, has sold very handsomely, been translated into about 28 languages. And I just get a lot of inquiries from interesting people who've read my name in the acknowledgements of that book from all over the world and from all over North America. And it's given me access to an extraordinary range of clients. So it's another sort of serendipitous encounter. I represent a former deputy director of a US intelligence agency. I mean, why he would choose me in London is bizarre, but I'm thrilled he has, and I do know how to help him. And we just sold his book, in fact, so in America. So now I really am I've become a very US-facing agent. I mean, I spend a lot of time submitting stuff in America or in the US first, and that's thrilling. And that's not, I did have American clients before Chris Miller's Chippewa book. I certainly did, but that book just succeeded at a level that changed a lot of things for me.
And a final question from me. It's rule of the podcast that we always ask about money. So maybe from your early days editing birdwatching books to today, how has the financial side of your career evolved?
Wow. I first started at HarperCollins on £12,000 a year, which was crap, even in 1990 standards. Brutal. Fortunately, my wife, who was my girlfriend at the time, had a sort of job, so we just about had enough to live on, but it was brutal. I think by the time I left Weidenfeld, which was in 99, I think I was on 50,000. Well, I could be wrong about that. In the 25 years since then, it's gone up a bit. Yeah, I'm making a good living as an agent. It's a volume business, you have to do it, and I don't make a salary. So for the last 10 years, I have not earned a salary. I've only lived on commission. So I've been forced to bet on not forced to, I've chosen to bet on myself. But it sharpens up your thinking and decision making, that's for sure.
Well, thank you very much, Toby, for speaking to us today and wishing you the very best with all of your projects going forward.
You're very welcome. It's been a huge pleasure. Thank you.
That was the Always Take Notes interview with Toby Mundy. He's on Twitter at Toby Mundy, and Evitas Creative's website is evitascreative.com. Hello, it's us again. Rachel, what was your takeaway from the interview with Toby?
I found Toby to be a very witty and self-effacing guest, and I enjoyed his anecdotes from the world of publishing. I thought there was some great insights there. I particularly enjoyed his piece of advice to go to your local bookstore and find out about which books are selling and how companies are doing, that way getting a sense of the market. How about you?
I kind of find it fascinating with these agents who talk openly about how, it's a selling profession and it fits in the compass of other selling professions. I mean, he talked, I think, about he had brief stints selling bagels on Camden Market, I think, as a young man, which he put in his career trajectory. It reminds me a bit of Johnny Geller selling, what was it? Insulation, windows, something like that. Textured paint, I think, in fact, was what it was selling. So, I think, that is ultimately the kind of fundamental of what they do. And I think these interviews are really valuable because, writers, particularly famous writers, talk all the time, but literary agents don't. And I certainly draw a lot of wisdom from these conversations. So I hope that our listeners are able to too. And I suppose, obviously, as we said at the top of the episode, we interviewed him before all the current fracas about Baillie Gifford and festivals arose. His involvement is at a slightly different level because I think they're continuing with their prize sponsorship. But yeah, that's obviously a very current debate as well.
Yes, very much so. Before we wrap up, we also want to say a very big thank you to Iqbal Hussain, who has supported the show on Patreon and also sent us a truly delightful email. Iqbal has just published his debut novel called Northern Boy with Unbound. It's the perfect summer read, he says, telling the story of a flamboyant young boy growing up in the 1980s in a former northern mill town. He's a butterfly among the bricks, struggling to remain true to himself when all around people are telling him to conform. It's full of glamour, he says, but it doesn't shy away from the less pleasant themes of the time. We are wishing you all the very best with it, Iqbal, and all your writing going forward.
This has been Always Take Notes, hosted by me, Simon Acomb.
And me, Rachel Lloyd.
Our producer and social media editor is Artemis Irvin. Our score is by Jessica Danheiser, and our graphic design is by James Edgar.
If you'd like to follow us on social media, we're on Twitter at Take Notes Always, on Instagram at Always Take Notes. You can support us on our crowdfunding page on Patreon under Always Take Notes. And if you'd like to leave a review on iTunes or get in touch with us via our website, please do.
Many thanks. Goodbye.